Welcome to Excel for Accountants, where we're going to learn how to use formulas, SUMIFS functions, VLOOKUP function, the new Power Query, pivot tables, the new Power Pivot, flash fill charts, and more. This is going to be your one-stop shopping for how to become awesome with Excel. Now, this is actually a seminar at Central Washington University in Des Moines, April 25th, 2017. Now, I'm actually filming this video before April 25th, and I'm filming with a particular version of Excel. I'm using Excel 2016 Office 365 Pro Plus Insider Edition. Now, this Insider Edition just means that I get updates from Microsoft every month with new features. Now, the computer lab that the seminar is in is using Excel 2016 Professional Plus, and you may have a different version at home. Now, there may be some slight differences because I'm on the Insider Edition. And by the way, starting with their next version of Excel, which is probably Excel 2018, all versions will be like this, meaning you will just get updates automatically every month. Now, here's our amazing list of topics. Now, we're going to start with the topic, keyboards are fast. And actually, we're not really going to start there. We're going to start on topic number 2, because all the way through the video for all the topics, we will talk about keyboards. And why are they so important? Because they are faster than doing it with a mouse and ribbons. All right, our first topic is a review of basics. We're going to talk about the basics of formula, cell references, and number formatting. So let's go over to the sheet formula, cell reference, number formatting. Click on that sheet, and here's our first example. Now, on each sheet, you will see a set of notes. These are all the key concepts that we're going to cover in the video. And so I put the notes off to the side for you. All right, our first example, we have a column of employees, gross pay, a tax rate of 15.3%, and we need to create a formula to calculate deduction and copy it down. Now, in Excel, you distinguish a formula from other types of cell content like text, and you can see the text up in the formula bar, or a number. You distinguish a formula from everything else that can go in a cell with the equal sign. So anytime you do a formula, the very first character is an equal sign. Now, we need to take our gross pay that's sitting in cell B2. So I'm going to take my mouse and click on B2. Now we need to multiply it. So we use our asterisk, and we're going to multiply it by our tax rate of 0.153. I just violated the number one most important rule in Excel, Excel's golden rule. If a formula input can change, like tax rates change sometimes, put it in a cell with a label and refer to it in the formula with a cell reference. We never want to hard code numbers unless they're numbers that will never change, like 24 hours in a day, 7 days in a week. So I'm going to highlight that and use the delete key. We want to click on the tax rate. Now, if I hit enter, that will calculate correctly. Now, I'm going to click back up on the cell and use the delete key, because we want to talk about 2 different ways to enter cell references. By all means, you can use your mouse. Click on one cell to my left times E2. Now I'm going to click the escape key to revert back to that empty cell before I put it in edit mode. And now I'm going to show you the second way to put cell references in. Equal sign, and use your arrow key. So I'm going to left arrow times right arrow, right arrow. Now notice, if we have a choice, which one should we do? Well, if the cell references are close, arrow keys are going to be faster. If the cell reference were way down here, and watch this, notice the dancing ants. If the cell reference for tax rate was way over here, it would be faster to use our mouse. Now, wait a second, look at that. As long as there's dancing ants around your cell reference, that means you're in full edit mode. So if you accidentally click on the wrong cell, no problem. Click back on the correct cell. Now, I want to try and enter this formula and copy it down. Now, the first time we entered the formula, I used the Enter key, but that put the formula in the cell and selected the cell below. Well, if I want to copy it, then that means I have to click back up and then copy it. So instead of using Enter, let's use Control Enter. Anytime you want to put something in the cell and keep the cell selected because you're going to do something to it, use Control Enter. Now notice the cell is selected, and in the lower right-hand corner, that little green box, that's called the fill handle. This cursor right here, big white cross with a black shadow, that's called the selection cursor. If you move your selection cursor on top of the fill handle, it'll turn to a crosshair, or I like to call it an angry rabbit. That allows us to click and drag, meaning we're copying our formula. Now, I'm not going to drag it all the way down. I'm going to drag it to there. What? Wait a second. Let's click in the last cell and use F2 to put the cell in edit mode. Wait a second. That didn't work at all. What I really wanted was gross pay, one cell to my left, times locked on E2. So that means we have to learn the difference between relative cell reference, which always means the formula is going to look relative to me, the formula, one cell to the left and two cells to the right. That's called a relative cell reference. So we need to come back up, highlight, delete, equal sign, left arrow times right arrow, right arrow. We have to distinguish right now what's a relative cell reference from locked cell reference on E2. The Microsoft term they use is absolute. And the way you do that is you make sure your cursor is touching the cell reference and hit the F4 key. It puts the secret code in there, those dollar signs. Now, those dollar signs mean that this cell reference is locked. So Control Enter. And now let's point to the fill handle. And when I see my angry rabbit, I'm going to click and drag. Now I'm going to go to the last cell and hit F2. That is like magic. It totally got the relative cell reference, one to my left, which is what we want. Every formula has to look at the gross pay one to the left. But sure enough, the dollar signs means it's locked on E2 as we copy our formula down. Now I'm going to hit Enter, and I would like to add this column up. So the cell C27 is selected. I could come to Home, over to Editing, and there's the Sum button. But I want you to notice something. When you hover your cursor over the auto sum, it tells you what the keyboard shortcut is. Alt equals. Now, out of 450 possible functions in Excel, only one of them is cool enough to have a keyboard, and it's the sum function. Why? Because it's the one used most often. So with that cell selected, I'm going to use Alt equals. And check that out. The dancing ants are allowing you to verify that the correct range was selected, because it tried to guess for you, and it doesn't always guess correctly. But for us, if you have a column of numbers above, it'll almost always guess correctly. All right, so I'm going to hit Enter. Let's come over here, and I'm going to try this again. I love this. Alt equals, verify that it's correct, and Enter. Now we are going to come back to this later because there's going to be a mistake with this column. So we need to talk about something called number formatting. Now notice we put our tax rate in as a decimal. If we were converting this to a percentage, we take that decimal, slide it 2 to the right, put a decimal, and add a percentage symbol. Well, in Excel, we use number formatting to do that. So with the cell selected, Home, Number Formatting Group, and there's a drop-down. By the way, let's go ahead and try this. This is not a good button. I'm going to click on it. Boop. What? It changed it to 15%? No. Our first lesson about number formatting is that it is just a facade. Number formatting displays the number in a certain way without changing the underlying number. You can look up to the formula bar. I still see the 15.3. It's just displaying it with 0 decimals. So if we come up and increase using that button, boop, boop. Now I've increased the decimals. Notice when I decrease, it's not changing the number. So the number one important lesson about number formatting is it just displays the number a certain way. Don't get tricked by it. All right, now we want to come over here, and we're going to highlight all the deduction formulas, but not the total. And I want to come up and apply currency. Well, wait a second. Currency's already selected, but I would like to erase that number formatting and look at what is really in the cell. To erase all number formatting, you apply general number formatting. And look at that. There's a bunch of unrounded decimals that we have to get rid of. If we are calculating dollar amounts with pennies, we're only allowed to go to the penny position. So 0.76, that should be rounded to 76 and remove the 0.46. That 32, that should be rounded up to 33, removing the extraneous decimals. Now, the reason that this is a problem, and I'm going to reapply currency, is people apply currency and think that it's rounded. And then when they add, they get the incorrect amount because formulas, including our SUM function, do not see number formatting. The SUM function is acting on those unrounded numbers. So it's got a bunch of unrounded numbers over there. And so, of course, it's getting the incorrect number. Why is it so important if it's only a penny or two off? Because in accounting, it matters. If you have an employee or a customer with an invoice that finds that you calculated a penny or two off, they're not going to trust your calculation. Now, I actually want to come down here and prove to you that this is a real problem. We're going to say, hey, gross pay times tax rate F4, Control Enter, and I'm going to copy it down. Now I'm going to come to the last cell, Alt equals, and Enter. We can, with our eye, see that $3.94 plus $2.05 does not equal 6. You could even prove it further. Type the numbers you see up here in the cell. Type it, Enter. 2.05, Enter, Alt equals. And, of course, that's the correct total. Now, on our example here, here's the unrounded version. And we will learn how to use this round function in just a second. And if you come down to the bottom, that is the incorrect total. When you use round, you get the correct total. So in accounting, it is mandatory when you have dollar amounts, especially when you're multiplying decimals like we're here and have extraneous decimals, it's mandatory to use the round function. Now, actually, there is a caveat. If I were not going to use any of these formula results in any subsequent formulas, then I wouldn't have to round because that just means I'm looking at it. And looking at it, these look correct. But if you have formula results that are going to be used in the subsequent formula, you have to use the round. Now, F2 puts our formula in edit mode. Now, very carefully, I'm going to put my cursor after the equal sign and before our formula. And I'm going to type the word round. But watch what happens when I type an R, a drop down with all the potential functions that start with R. O, Roman, what is that? U, round. Look at that. There's a bunch of rounds. The standard rounding is just round. And you can read over here the screen tip. Rounds a number to a specific number of digits. And if you weren't sure, you could actually arrow through each one of these and see which one is the correct one for your calculation. Once the function you want is highlighted in blue, you hit the Tab key. Now, we have our round number. That just means your formula. You very carefully click at the end. This is called a screen tip, and screen tips are very polite. Right now it says, hey, put the formula in for the number, which we already did. The screen tip then reminds you to get to the next argument, you have to type a comma. So I'm going to type a comma. And look at that. It highlights in bold. Now, number of digits, that's just the position you want to round to. So remember, we're rounding to the penny. So you count on your fingers from the decimal going to the right. 1, 2. Because the penny is the second position, you type a 2. Now, sometimes you want to round to other positions, but in accounting, it's almost always the 2. If you wanted to round to a different position, like you're counting decimal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you keep adding numbers as you go to the right. But notice, what if you wanted to round to the dollar or the tens position or hundreds position or thousands positions for financial statements? Well, then you'd have to count backwards. If the penny is 2, that's the way I always remember it. I go 2, 1, 0 is for the dollar. -1, -2, -3 would be to the thousands. By the way, if you forget that, there's some notes over here. But you can also, on the screen tip, click the name of the function. It's got a blue hyperlink, and it will jump to Office Online and give you a description, including examples. Now I'm going to close this. For us, we have our 2. Close parentheses. Now I'm going to Control-Enter. I want to copy this down. And actually, watch this. We're going to totally prove that this works. Highlight the whole column. Let's apply General. I can already see that the formula with round works. But there, we need to remove. That one should become 33 and remove the 809. When I click with my Angry Rabbit and drag down, look at that. Just like that, I have properly rounded, and now our total at the bottom is correct. Now I'm going to highlight this and apply currency. Now the difference between currency and accounting, accounting will always have the $ fixed on the outside left. And if you have a 0, if I type a 0 here just to demonstrate, it has a little dash like when you zero out your accounts before closing to equity. Now I'm going to Control-Z because I want that formula there. Highlight this whole column. Currency has what is called a floating $sign. All right, so that's our first example. We talked about formulas, cell references, number formatting, and the round function. Let's go over to our next sheet called If. Now we're going to click in the cell C4, and we have a bonus column that we need to calculate. We have employees and sales. For every single employee sales, we need to compare it to this hurdle. If your sales are greater than or equal to 20,000, then your bonus will be $250. If the employee's sales are less than 20,000, then the bonus will be 0. Now notice right here, 250, right here, 0. That means in every single cell, we potentially want one of two values, 250 or 0. Anytime you have that situation where a cell gets one of two values, you can use the if function. I'm going to type equal I immediately see from the drop-down that if function is highlighted in blue, so I hit Tab. Now there's 3 arguments for the if function. Logical test, that's whether or not true or false they got over the hurdle. Then the rest of this function is easy. What do you want to put in the cell if it's true, which would be 250? Then what do you want to put in the cell if it's false? That will be our 0. Now the logical test. Well, in English we're saying, are the sales greater than or equal to the hurdle? And notice the answer to that question is one of two things, true or false. So I'm going to click on, as a relative cell reference, the employee sales. And I'm going to ask the question, are you greater than or equal to the hurdle? Now, in math, greater than or equal to is a single symbol. But in Excel, you have to type greater than and then an equal sign. Those two symbols together represent the comparative operator greater than or equal to. Now, if you look over here, here's a list of all of the possible comparative operators. And notice if we used any one of these, are you equal? Are you not equal to? Greater, less than, greater than or equal, less than or equal to. Anytime you use these, the result will come out true or false. Now for us, we're going to click over on the hurdle. The question we're asking is, are the employee sales greater than or equal to the hurdle? Now when we copy this formula down, the blue one needs to move relatively, but E4 needs to be locked. So I'm going to hit the F4 key to put the $signs in. Now we look to our screen tip. What do we have to type to get to the next argument? A comma. Value if true. That means if this logical statement comes out true, well, that means they're over the hurdle. So we're going to click on the value we want to put in the cell if it comes out true. Now I'm going to hit the F4 key to lock that, because that has to be locked as we copy it down. Comma. Now the value of false, well, we don't need to put this in a cell off to the side with a label because it's never going to change. So I simply type in a 0. And that is our formula, close parentheses. Now, logical test, that's always something that comes out true or false. And then the rest of it is easy. What do you want to put in the cell if it's true? What do you want to put if it's false? Now I'm going to Control-Enter, and now we're going to learn a new way of copying down a column. I'm going to take my selection cursor, and when I hover over the fill handle, I'm going to double-click. And just like that, it copied it all the way down. Now, the way that it knew how to do that is it kept looking. Is there something in the cell? Is there something in the cell? When it got down to here, there was nothing there, so it stopped one cell above. Now, we want to make sure and click in the last cell, F2. We always have to verify, are the cell references all in the correct place? Yes, they are. That is a lot faster than having to manually do this. Now let's go look at another great accounting example. Here's a mini income statement. Net sales, operating expense, administrative expense, other. Now total expenses. I'm going to click down in the cell. And what's the keyboard for the sum function? Alt equals. And what do we always say? Alt equals and verify. Yes, the sum function's programmed to add all the numbers above. But it can't possibly be smart enough to get it right all the time. We definitely don't want to add net sales with our expenses. So this is where the dancing ants come in. We simply click and drag to select the correct range and enter. Now look at this. This is a terrible aspect of Excel. That little green arrow, if you click in the cell, you can come over to the Smart tag and click the little downward pointing black arrow. And it says formula omits adjacent cell. Well, of course it does, because we can't have revenue or sales in our total expense formula. Now, this is called error checking, and a lot of times it just flat out doesn't work. We can temporarily say ignore the error, or I normally on my work computer go to error checking options and turn it off. All right, but for the time being, I'm going to say ignore error. Now we're going to come down here and create a formula for net income. In fact, let's come over here and type net income. Now I'm going to use tab, because my goal is to put something in the cell, and I'm immediately going to do something in the cell to the right. So I use tab. Now, equal sign, and what's the formula? Up arrow to get net revenue minus up arrow for total expenses, and enter. Now I'm going to highlight all of this and go up to border. Here's the drop down for border. We can use all borders. You can also right-click, and here, this is called the mini toolbar. You can get to the border drop down. I'm going to highlight all borders. Now, for an income statement, we usually want a dark line right above a cell where there is a calculation. F2, that's adding. Then down at the bottom, when we get to our bottom line, whether it's net income or total assets or inventory value, we want to have a double line on the bottom. Now, I'm going to highlight the cell, and we're going to use the Format Cells dialog box. Now, you could click the dialog launcher to open up Format Cells dialog box. You could use right-click Format Cells. But the absolute fastest way is to use the keyboard Control-1. Now, Control-1 is very handy because that will also work for formatting chart elements, which we'll see later in this video. Now, Format Cells is very important. It has all the different things you can do to format cells. On the Number tab, there's all of our number formatting. We can use alignment, font, border, fill protection. We want border. Now, the way it works is you select your line first, then the color. Automatic is fine. Black is fine for us. Then we have a few ways to apply. I like to take my cursor and click. Now, notice over here, there's an outside, and then there's a line on the inside. Since the top is what we want, I'm going to click on the top, and it applies the selected line. If we wanted to change it back, we click on the line we want and select the location. Now, this is the one we want. If you don't like drawing like this, then you can use the buttons, and there it is. Now I'm going to click OK. It doesn't look any different to me, but when you click off to the side, there is your border. Now let's do this to the bottom. This gets a solid line, and then the bottom gets a double line. Control 1, I select the line, draw. Select the line, draw. Click OK. And now when I click off to the side, there we go. Now normally, you would not have green in an income statement. I always use green when I'm teaching so we know that these are the cells that are going to get the formulas. Now let's just change this. Let's say that net sales were a dismal 1,895. Well, of course, then this is negative, and this should be net loss. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm actually going to double-click a word, just like we do over in Word, to highlight it, and type loss. Enter. Now we change this again. This is actually 6,000. Well, this is positive. This is back to net income. So the point is, this cell gets one of two things. Anytime that's the case, you can use the if function. Now, our example up here, we use the if function to put one of two numbers. But down here, we're going to use the if function to put one of two text items. Now, notice I have the cell selected, and I want to put a formula here. I do not have to hit the delete key first. Because it's highlighted, I can simply type whatever I want, and it automatically replaces it. Equal sign, I, tab. What is the logical test? What determines when we have net loss? Anytime total expenses are greater than our net sales. Now, we didn't put the equal sign there because we'll assume that the label net income is OK when there's a 0. We want net loss only when there's a negative number. So anytime expenses are bigger than our sales, we look to our screen tip, comma. Then what do we want? Now, we cannot type net loss because look what it thinks it's doing. It thinks that we should have a function here. If you actually want text in your formula, you always have to put it in double quotes. So net loss and double quote. So that's what's going to go in the cell if it's true, comma. What are we going to put in the cell if it's false? In double quotes, net income, and double quotes, close parentheses. Now, this logical test actually could have been constructed a few different ways. We chose to ask the question, total expenses less than net sales. Then our value of true is net loss, value of false is net income. Now, anytime we do a formula like this, we want to hit Enter and we want to test it. Is it working right now? Yes. Now come up here, 1,000. Yes, it's working. But we also want to test when it's exactly right on. So I'm going to type 2,592.3. And when I hit Enter, yes, it's working. All three possibilities, 0, negative, or positive. Now I'm going to change this back to 1,000. And we still have a problem here. Notice on an income statement, the convention is to always show this as a positive number and indicate the sign with a label. So what are we going to do? I'm going to hit the F2 key. Well, luckily, if you remember your math, there's something called absolute value. And if I look at the very first function, it says returns the absolute value of number. That just means it returns the distance from 0, or it returns every number as a positive number. Minus 10 is 10. 10 is 10. All right, I'm going to hit Tab, and that will work for our income statement. Close parentheses, Enter. Now we test all three. We've tested the negative. Yes, that's working. 2592.3, we're testing exactly equal. And now we're going to test 6,000. It is working fine. All right, so that is how to put one of two text items into a cell using the if function. And up here we saw one of two numbers into a cell using the if function. All right, now we want to go over to our next sheet, SUMIFS and COUNTIFS. Now, our next topic has to do with adding numbers and counting text items. Now, normally what we do, as we saw earlier in this video, is we do Alt equals and add up all the items. But most of the times when you're adding and counting in your accounting job, you're not interested in all of the items. you're interested in just some of the items. So if we were going to add all the sales for Sue, how would we do it manually? We'd actually have to use two columns, sales rep and the sales. We would have to manually go through and match our condition or criteria against each item. If it's not Sue, we're not going to use that number. If it is Sue, we're going to use that number. So I've already highlighted in yellow to see that manually we'd have to add 200, 100, 400, and 600, 1,300. But we don't want to do that manually. We want to use an amazing function called SUMIFS. Now sum, that means it's adding. Ifs, that means it's going to sum if one or more conditions are true. Now I'm going to hit Tab. The screen tips, the sum range, those are all the numbers you potentially want to add. So you highlight all of the numbers. Now you look at the screen tip, comma, criteria range. Now I'm going to hit comma again. It says criteria range, comma, criteria. The way you figure out which one is which is this one says criteria range. So that means you have to give it the entire column of sales rep. There's criteria range. Now we type a comma, and you tell SUMIFS which item to look for. So I'm going to say, hey, go find all of Sue's sales. Now we're going to enter this formula just to see if we get the correct answer. Control Enter, and we do, 1,300. Now we need to copy this formula down, so I'm going to put the cell in edit mode using F2. And notice we forgot to lock them. So here's a great trick. Click inside the SUMIFS and then use the argument name and click it. It'll automatically highlight the entire range. Now you can hit the F4 key because notice this is a range. We're going to copy it down. If we didn't lock it, it would move successively down one row at a time. So we locked it. Now we click on criteria range 1, F4. And finally, criteria 1, that's a relative cell reference. Here it's looking at Sue. But when it gets down to the next row, it'll look at Amira, Chin, and then Monifa. Control Enter, and double click and send it down. I'm going to the last cell, and I'm going to hit F2. Anytime you copy a formula, you've got to verify in that last cell if all the cell references are correct. Now, poor Monifa, it says 0 here. Excel formulas don't make errors. And I can clearly see there's at least one there. Oh, my heavens. Look at all those sales that it missed. Well, anytime you are making Excel formulas with conditions or criteria, even our if function in our last example, if we get a 0 result, F2, and we checked all the cell references, then the problem is coming from either the criteria or some of the data in the columns. Now I'm going to click Escape. Easy enough to check the criteria first. I'm going to come to this cell, and remember F2 always puts the cell in edit mode and puts the cursor at the end. And sure enough, there's an extra space there. Now I'm going to click Escape, come over here, F2. Look at that. All of these, if you check them, do not have a space. So F2, 6 letters and a space. That means Excel, SUMIF function over here, is trying to find exactly those 7 characters. Backspace, then hit Enter, and sure enough, now we get the correct total. Now, I put this in here intentionally because that is an incredibly common problem when people type data. So when you get space, enter a 0, no worries. Put the formula in edit mode, check to see if the cell references are right, and then go and check your data. Backspace and enter. All right, now if we want to count how many sales Sue had and Chin and so on, well, again, we could do it manually, but forget that. Especially this is a small data set. Most of the time in accounting, we get 5, 10, 20,000 rows of sales, and we want to count how many sales each sales rep had. Equals, and now we'll use not SUMIFS, but COUNTIFS. By the way, there is COUNTIF without an S, SUMIF without an S. Those are older functions from earlier in Excel's history. That only did one condition or criteria. We always want to use the SUMIFS or COUNTIFS with the S because it'll do one or more conditions. Criteria range, that's all the names. Now immediately once I highlight that, I'm going to come over here and F4, comma. Now I'm going to do left arrow to get Sue as the criteria. Control Enter. Double click and send it down. Go to the last cell, F2. That is looking good. Now let's go look at another example. Here we're going to see how to use SUMIFS with two conditions. For each cell, we need to go through this data set, find the sales rep from the sales rep column, and then make sure that it's the product quad from the product column. So in order to get our SUMIFS to work, we're definitely going to have to use the sales column, sales rep column, and product. So you ready? Equals SUMIFS, the sum range. Now I got to show you a great trick. Instead of clicking and dragging all the way down, oh, look at that. That takes forever. I'm going to use the keyboard Control Backspace to jump back to the active cell. I'm going to click on Sum Range and delete instead of doing it manually. This is probably the best example of why keyboard shortcuts are fast. Click in the top cell and use the keyboard Control Shift and down arrow. Look at that. It went down 11,000 rows in a split second. Now I can see my screen tip over here. I need to lock this range so I can copy it down. So I'm going to hit the F4 key. And not only does F4 put the dollar signs in, but it jumps the screen back in view. Comma. Criteria range 1. I can do this in any order. This is going to be an AND logical test. If I were to scroll down and look, it doesn't matter in which order it finds Amira and Quad, as long as the particular record has both Amira and Quad. Then it will pick out that number. So I'm going to choose to do sales rep first. Click in the top cell, Control Shift down arrow, F4 to lock it and jump back, comma. Remember, the trick is it says criteria range. So range means the whole column, comma. If it just says criteria, then you know that's the individual condition or criteria. Comma, criteria range 2. We're going to click on the top cell for product. Control Shift down arrow, F4. Now I see criteria range 2, comma. And now I'm going to up arrow to get quad and immediately hit F4. Close parentheses. And that is going to add with two conditions. Control Enter. Copy it down. I'm definitely going to the last cell and hitting F2 to verify that every one of the cell references and ranges are in the correct location. Now enter Alt equals, and there is our sales rep based on product report. Now there's a drop down here, so we can easily change this to Eagle, and instantly our report updates. Try-fly, there are the numbers. Now we'll see how to create that drop down later in this video. Now another very important task for SUMIFS is to count or add sales based on the month. Now I already filled this criteria out. I had to very carefully put greater than or equal to this date and less than or equal to this date. And the way I always think of this is that greater than symbol is looking over to the column. So anytime it finds any item over there that is greater than or equal to the lower limit, which means the 1st of January, and the date, notice the less than symbol is pointing over here, and the date is also less than or equal to the upper limit, the end of January, then we can either count or add. Now in this case, I'm going to use the SUMIFS functions to add. The sum range, click in the top, Control Shift down arrow, F4, comma, criteria range. It's the date column. I click in the top, Control Shift down arrow, F4, comma. Now I put the lower limit. And guess what? This is going to be an AND logical test, just like up here. It doesn't matter in which order you put these. I'm going to put the lower limit first. That's a relative cell reference, comma. And guess what? We're asking two questions of the same column. So we have to repeat the date column. Click in the top cell, Control Shift down arrow, F4, comma. And then criteria 2, arrow key to get that upper limit. Close parentheses, Control Enter, and copy it down. Now I come to the bottom, F2. All the cell references are looking good. Enter, Alt equals, verify that the dancing ants are dancing around the correct range, and enter. So on this sheet, we saw how to use SUMIFS to get monthly revenue from a large data set. We saw how to use two conditions based on two different columns and then add. And up here, we started with the basics of SUMIFS and COUNTIFS. Now, our next topic is one of the more important topics for accountants. I'm going to click on the sheet V1. And this topic has to do with the VLOOKUP function, but the basic concept is looking stuff up. If I look at this table right here and ask you the question, what is Chuck's Hale hire date? Well, you would know to go through the first column, find a match, jump over from the first column, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth column to get the hire date, and then report back that you found 5/17/2012. If I asked you, where's June Allair's address? Well, you'd find her as the first item in the first column, jump over from the first column to the second column, and get the address and report it as 3557 First Street. Down here is another example. If I ask you the question, what is your earned commission if your sales were $6,000? Well, you'd race through the first column here and realize that this category right here is from 5,000 all the way up to 12,500, but not including 12,500. You'd realize that the 6,000 was here, so your earned commission would be $200. Yet another example, if I ask you what the price for quad is, you'd race through the first column, find quad, jump over to the third column, and report back that $40 is the price. Now we're going to learn how to do this with the VLOOKUP function. And the VLOOKUP function will look up a particular item, find a match, go over to the correct column, get the $40, and bring it back to the cell that the formula is in. As a last example, tax. If your income was $3,000, what was the tax? Well, somewhere right here, your tax would be $60. All right, now let's go over to the sheet V2. Now, over here on V2, we have, with the VLOOKUP function, two types of lookup. And the one we're going to look at on this sheet is called exact match. And what does that mean? If I ask you to look up Chuck's Hale, that means it's going to look for exactly all of those characters in a row and try and find a match. It will find a match here. And then we can retrieve whichever column number we want. Address would be 2. City would be 3. Hire date would be 8. All right, let's see our first example of VLOOKUP. Equal sign, I'm going to type a V because VLOOKUP starts with the letter V. I'm going to type an L, and sure enough, there's VLOOKUP. Now I'm going to hit Tab. There are 4 arguments for VLOOKUP. Lookup value. Now, just like we have to know what the item is that we're looking up and trying to find a match, VLOOKUP also has to have a lookup value. So we're going to tell VLOOKUP to look up this employee. Now, I type a comma to get to the next argument. Just like we, if we were doing this manually, would know where the table is to find a match and then try and retrieve something, VLOOKUP needs the table also. Now notice the name of the argument, table array. I always remember, oh yeah, it has the word table, so I need to highlight the entire table. Now for VLOOKUP, you do not need the field names or column headers. You want just the items that you potentially want to look up, and then any of the subsequent columns that have items to retrieve. And there's our table, comma, column index number. Now, just like we would manually, if we're trying to find email, we would actually look over to the column header and find email. Or alternatively, we could count on our fingers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's the 6th column that has the item we want to go and get and bring back to the cell. So column, whenever I see that column, it reminds me, oh yeah, that's the column number for the item we want to go and retrieve and bring back to the cell. So I'm just going to type a 6, comma. And look at that. There's 2 options for VLOOKUP. Exact match is what we're doing in this example. Exact match means we're going to find exactly those characters in the first column. Approximate match is what you use when you're doing taxes or commissions. And we'll look at that example next. Now, this dropdown allows you to down arrow and then tab. But notice it puts the word false there. Now, I'm going to backspace. They arbitrarily picked true and false. This isn't like the true-false logical test we had with the if function. It's just that's what the designers of the function decided to use in this fourth argument to tell VLOOKUP function which type of lookup to do. Now, you could down arrow and false, and that will tell VLOOKUP to do exact match. Now, in all of computers, there's true and false, but you can alternatively put 1 for true and 0 for false. And so that's the convention I'm going to use. I'm going to put a 0 whenever I want exact match. You can do it whichever way, 0 or false. Close parentheses and enter. And sure enough, look at that. It went and found from the fifth column the correct email address. Now, if I come here and change this, notice I type June Alir and enter. What is going on there? Well, the same exact thing as with SUMIFS and COUNTIFS. If I F2, you can't have extra spaces because exact match VLOOKUP is trying to find exactly those characters. And it doesn't find that name with the space. So if I backspace and hit enter, now it works. Now, we can prevent that kind of error here by using data validation. Now, let's try that for our next example. We need to look up phone. Here's the employee. Well, guess what? If we already have the VLOOKUP table up here and we have the exact list of names, we can use the data validation feature. Now, we select the cell where we want the drop-down list to be located. We go up to the Data ribbon tab, over to Data Tools, and there's Data Validation. I click this button, and up pops the Data Validation dialog box. Now, by default, data validation is set up to allow anything to go into a cell. So all of the cells in a spreadsheet, when you open up a blank workbook, allow anything. But we can limit the type of data that goes into the cell. Now, we could do all sorts of things. We could say what type of whole number, decimal, date, time, text length. But the one we want is list. So I'm going to click list. And sure enough, down here in source, if I click, I can simply highlight the first column of the lookup table. And notice it says in cell dropdown. Now, we will not be able to type something into this cell unless it's exactly like one of the items in this list. Now, I click OK. And when I click here, there's the dropdown. I can select whichever item. And when I select June Allaire, there's not going to be an extra space. Now, let's look up the phone number equals VL tab. The lookup value, that's the item we need to remember and try and find a match in the first column, comma. I see the argument table array. The word table reminds me it's the entire table, first column and all subsequent columns without the field names, comma. Column index number. Column reminds me that I have to count on my fingers until I find phone. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I type a 7, comma. We're doing exact match, so you can put false or the equivalent 0. Close parentheses and enter. Now, this is amazing because we have a drop-down. I can select whichever employee, and there is our phone number. Now, notice that that drop-down is sort of in the way of the cell. Now, there's a few ways we could deal with this. One way to deal with it is to click in the cell. And on the Home ribbon tab, we could use the indent feature. You could also insert a small column as long as the lookup area is not directly below the table, because I don't want to insert an extra column into the table. Now, we want to look up address, but I would like to have this data validation down in this cell. So I'm going to Control-C and Control-V. And sure enough, it copied not only the content, but the data validation. All right, you ready? Equals VL tab, left arrow to get the lookup value, comma, the table, highlight the entire table, comma. I'm going to count on my fingers. 1, 2. I'm typing a 2, comma, false or 0 for exact match. Close parentheses and enter. Now, what if we wanted to look up salary? That's the very last column, the 9th column. Now, this formula I want to copy. So I'm going to type VL tab, left arrow, comma, highlight the entire table, F4 to lock it, comma, 9, comma, 0, close parentheses, Control Enter, double click and send it down, go to the last cell in F2. That is pretty amazing. Now that's VLOOKUP exact match. We are trying to match exactly those characters in the first column. Let's go over to the sheet V3. And on this sheet, we want to talk about approximate match VLOOKUP. Now our first example, here are your sales, and we need to figure out with the formula what your commissioned earned is. Now notice with approximate match, if I tell VLOOKUP right here to look up 7,500, there's no way it could find an exact match over here unless it was exactly 5,000, 0, and so on. So the way approximate match lookup is going to work is VLOOKUP will take the 7,500 and race through the first column until it bumps into the first number bigger than it, and then it will jump back. And that's how it will know to get this category and that $200 commission. Now I want to look over here. This is explicitly the categories. Now notice the number at the head of the row for this category is the lower limit, and it is included. It's 0 all the way up to, but not including 5,000. Explicitly over here, we can see that the sales have to be greater than or equal to 0. That's the lower limit, and less than the upper limit, which is always the number listed in the next category. So when we see 15,000 right here, it means equal to or greater than 15,000 and less than 20,000, the next number. All right, let's see how to do this. Equals VL tab, left arrow to look up our sales amount, comma, table. We're going to highlight the table, the first column and the second column with our commission, comma, column index. Commission is what we're trying to look up, so that's in the second column, comma. And here's where we want to use approximate match. So when you're using approximate, you can put true, 1, or you can leave it out entirely. Notice range lookup argument has a square bracket. That means that if you know what the default is, you can leave this argument out. VLOOKUP is programmed to do approximate match lookup when you do not enter this fourth argument. Now you have to make sure and stop when you get to column index number, and don't even put a comma to get to that argument. As long as we're doing approximate match, that's the shortest way to create this formula. So you can, for approximate match, put true, 1, or don't put the argument in at all. Close parentheses and enter. And there it is, 200. Your sales weren't actually 7,500. They were exactly 12,500. And you're much happier now because the VLOOKUP returned 625 bucks. But what it did was it looked this up, raced through till it found the first one bigger, and jumped back. Now, technically, that's not the way the algorithm works underneath in the code for VLOOKUP. It actually does what's called a binary search. But for understanding as a metaphor how VLOOKUP is getting that 625 bucks, races through, finds the first one bigger, jumps back. Now I want to decrease the decimals here. Notice what I'm doing is I'm using number formatting. Now I want to look at an example here. Let's say you got $12,499.99. When I hit enter, well, we see 12,500, so you might expect 625 bucks. But VLOOKUP is a formula, and formulas do not see number formatting. So what did it do? It actually, if we look up in the formula bar, it's looking up 12, 499, and 99 cents, races through, finds the first one bigger, which is 12,500. So of course it jumps back and returns a 200. Now I'm going to increase the decimals. Now here we had commission with an exact dollar amount. Oftentimes commissions are percentages. So if we have 7,500, we're going to need to look up the commission rate. So I'm going to click here, equals VL tab, left arrow, comma, the table, comma, 2, because commission rate's in the second column. That's the item we want to go and retrieve. We're doing approximate match, so I don't even put that argument in. Close parentheses, tab. Now to calculate your actual commissions, I say equal sign, the left arrow, times left arrow. When I hit enter, there is your earned commission, $356.25. Our next example, we have an income tax and we need to return the tax. Equals VL tab, left arrow, comma. We're going to get our table, comma. The second column has our tax, so I put a 2. We're doing approximate match, so we leave that fourth argument out. Close parentheses and enter. If I change the income tax to 0, well, of course, it's returning 0. Now we want to see what happens if we enter a number less than. So if I put -1, it's going to return an NA. So the rule for approximate match is it's going to race through and try and find a bigger one. Unless it can't even find a bigger one, then it returns not available. Let's type in a number bigger than the biggest one in our table. So I'm going to put 12,000 and enter. VLOOKUP took this 12,000, raced through, tried to find one bigger. When it didn't, then it simply took the last category, 175. All right, our last example on this sheet is a common example when you are in charge of payroll. We need to look up the commission amount and return it for each employee. Equals VL tab, left arrow, comma. We get our table, F4 to lock it, comma, 2, because the second column has our commission. We're doing approximate match lookup, so we leave that final argument out. Control Enter. Double click and send it down. Now I'm going to use Control arrow to jump down to the bottom, and then hit F2. I'm verifying that the cell references are correct. Escape, Control up arrow. All right, so on this sheet we did approximate match VLOOKUP. Now we want to go over to V4 sheet and look at a comprehensive example for VLOOKUP in SUMIFS. Your boss asks you for a regional sales report. Well, the boss gave you this table, date, sales rep, product, sales, but there's no region to create our regional sales report. But the boss also gave you a lookup table with a unique list of all of the sales rep and then the region in the second column. So before we can come over here and total the sales by each one of our region, we have to create what's called a helper column. This is an extra column in our data set that will add some data so that we're able to summarize the sales by the region. Here's our sales rep column. In the cell E4 equals VL tab, I'm going to left arrow over to get my relative cell reference for sales rep, comma. Now I'm going to highlight the first 2 cells, use Control Shift down arrow, F4 to lock it, comma. Column index, number 2 has our region, so I put a 2, comma. We're doing exact match. So I'm putting a 0, close parentheses, Control Enter. Double click and send it down. Control down arrow, F2 to verify that the cell references are correct. Escape. I'm going to use Control Home to jump back to cell A1. Now that we have our region helper column, we can come over here and use the SUMIFS to summarize by region. SUMIFS, the sum range. Click in the top cell, Control Shift down arrow, F4, comma. Criteria range, that's our new helper column with region, Control Shift down arrow, F4, comma, left arrow. There is our region. Close parentheses, Control Enter, double click and send it down. This is a great example for accountants. It is incredibly common. You are given a particular data set with sales, a lookup table. You have to create a helper column to create, in essence, the column of criteria to create a summary report. And then, of course, in our summary report, we can use SUMIFS. I'm going to click Escape. Now, what we did here is called data analysis or business intelligence. We went from lots of bits of raw data, both in our sales table and over in our lookup table. We made some calculations by adding a column, and then we summarized to get some useful information. We needed to determine which region had the largest sales. The process of going from raw data to useful information is called data analysis. Now we want to go over and specifically define data analysis and business intelligence. I'm going to click on the sheet DABI. Now here's some notes over here. But the main thing we want to do before defining data analysis and business intelligence is we want to define what a proper data set is. And even before defining what a proper data set is, we need to define what raw data is. Now if you look down here, this is not raw data. The date, sales rep name, product, and sales amount are all in a single cell. We can't use a sum function on this or SUMIFS with criteria. This is proper raw data. You want to break apart the transaction or whatever it is, the employee record, customer record, into its smallest pieces so you are able to analyze. We're able to use that number as a number, this text as a product name, sales rep name, and date. So number one, raw data. Number two, what is a proper data set? A proper data set always has field names or column headers at the top. Every system in the world that allows you to analyze data has field names at the top. And it makes sense, right? When it says product right there, it means what are you going to put in this column? Just the product. What are you going to put in here? Sales rep, date, sales. So proper data set, field names or column headers are always at the top. Records, or for us, transactions, are always in row. Now notice, each transaction has to have the date of the sale, the sales rep, product, and sales. And for us, we added an extra field with our region. Now this is a transaction, but the proper word is this is a record. And you can think of customer record where it has the customer name, their location, their telephone, email. Those are records. So field names at the top, records in rows. All data sets follow that convention. But in Excel, we also have to follow another convention. You have to have empty cells all the way around the data set. Now notice, I wanted to put notes here, but as soon as you put the note directly next to the data set, it will mess up your ability to use certain features. Most prominently, the pivot table, which we're going to learn next. All right, so 1, 2, 3, field names in the first row, records in rows, empty cells all the way around. Now, empty cells, you can also just have the actual row headers or column headers too. Now, what is data analysis? It's simply converting raw data into useful information for decision makers. This is the raw data. We converted the raw data into useful information. This is a simple example, and we'll see more examples later in the video. Business intelligence has a slightly more specific meaning, but it is exactly the same as data analysis. We're just converting raw data into useful information for decision makers. But business intelligence is the buzzword that has been around for the last 5 years. And the definition is, hey, we're going to convert raw data into useful, actionable information for decision makers in business situations. All right, now, raw data, proper data sets, data analysis, business intelligence. Let's go look at probably the most amazing feature in Excel, the pivot table. I'm going to click on the sheet P1, and we got to talk about the amazing pivot table. Now, off to the side, I have all the notes, but I'm going to scroll over. Now, in our last example, we had sales table, lookup table. We created this regional column and then added total sales for each region. So this is a regional sales report. If we have this proper data set and our goal is to create this report, we can use the pivot table feature instead. And it will be much easier to create than using SUMIFS formulas. Now, there is an advantage to SUMIFS that we'll mention in just a moment. But most of the time when we have this type of report, a pivot table is the way to go. Now, in order to use a pivot table, you have to have a proper data set. Field names at the top, records in rows, and, of course, empty cells all the way around, or column headers, row headers. Now, before we click in this data set and make our pivot table, I want to look at the end report first. Notice, what are we doing? We're making a calculation not on the entire sales column, but we're doing adding with a single condition. Anytime you're making calculations with conditions or criteria like we are here, you want to consider using a pivot table because that is the essence of a pivot table, making calculations with condition or criteria. The other thing is, if you visualize your report up front, and for us, notice that each row has our calculation, and at the head of the row is the condition. The condition for this calculation is south, and it sits at the head of the row. Visualizing the layout of this report will actually help us when we get to our pivot table task pane. All right, how do we create a pivot table? Proper data set. Click in a single cell. Go up to Insert. And over in the table group, there's the Pivot Table button. I'm going to click, and our Create Pivot Table dialog box comes up. Now, there's two steps to the Create Pivot Table dialog box. The first step is, where is the data set? Now, this feature will always guess right if you have a proper data set with empty cells all the way around. So most of the time, you don't have to worry about that. The second step is just, hey, where do you want to put this report? Most of the time, we're going to put it on a new worksheet. But to compare and contrast to the report we've already created, I'm going to put it on this existing worksheet. Click Location. I'm going to select J8. Now, a pivot table can pivot. And so sometimes it's dangerous to put it around other data or other reports. But for us, it'll be OK in this example. Click OK. And instantly, a pivot table field list appears with the different areas in the pivot table listed below. Now, our pivot table will appear over here. Now, remember what I said, summary calculations with conditions at the head of the row? Notice what happens when I click up. The pivot table field list goes away, but no problem. I click back inside the pivot table. I go over to my fields, and since I want to see the region in the row area, I'm going to click and drag. Notice the no symbol says you can't drag it there. I could drag it down to rows, which is where I want, or columns, or even filter the whole report, which we'll see later. But remember, I wanted to see the regions in the row area, so that's why I'm dropping it down in rows. And look at that. It instantly gave us a unique list. That means it went through the entire column and then listed exactly one of each. Now, imagine if you were trying to create this report and you were given this data set and you didn't know how many regions there were. You would have to manually do that. Pivot Table does it automatically. Now, we want to make a conditional calculation on the sales column. So we go over to our field list, drag sales, and criteria for our calculations go into column, filter, rows. The values area is where you make your calculations. So since we want to add on sales, I click and drag. Instantly, because it's a number, it defaults to sum. And it creates a label, sum of sales. And look at that. It calculated the same number in a fraction of the time. That's why pivot tables are so amazing. Now, there's a couple important things we want to do. Every time you create a pivot table, Seeing row labels as the header for our report is not a useful or helpful label. So immediately with the cell in the pivot table, you have to go up to these context-sensitive ribbon tabs, Pivot Table Tools, Design. Then you go over to Layout and Report Layout. And you either have to choose Outline Form or Show in Tabular Form. Instantly then, this report will always list the field names instead of row or column labels. The next thing we have to do is we want number formatting. Now, if you are in the cells, meaning you're using formulas, we would use Control-1. And I want you to notice something about this Format Cells. All the tabs are showing. We would have to go to number formatting and then add our number formatting. But it's different inside a pivot table. Click in one cell. Right-click. Do not point to Format Cells because that will open up the Format Cells dialog box. We want number formatting. Now, when I click number formatting, this will allow us to add number formatting to the actual field, not the cells. Now, notice there's only one tab here, the Number tab. If we're out here in the cells and right-click Format Cells, we see all of them. So as soon as you see all of them, you know that's the wrong dialog box. Escape, right-click, Number Format. That's the correct dialog box. Now I'm going to click Currency. Notice I didn't have to highlight all the cells, just a single cell. This dialog box will know to format the entire field. Click OK. Now that's important because if I ever pivot this table, because I formatted the field and not the specific cells, that formatting will follow the calculation around. Now, why is it called a pivot table? Well, imagine if your boss came in and you showed them this report and they said, I didn't want to see the region as the row header. I wanted to see it as the column header. Well, this is a pivot table, so I can pivot it from the rows over to the columns by simply coming over and dragging region over to columns. And just like that, the same set of calculations. Now I'm going to drag this back here. Now, as another example of a pivot table, let's say the boss says, hey, I don't want region, I want product. Well, I'm going to drag region off and then drag product down. And instantly, I get the sum calculation with a single condition or criteria. Here, this is the total for the product crested butte. Now, what if the boss said, hey, I wanted to see the product and region? Well, now we can simply drag region over to the columns area. And you're not going to believe this. Instantly, it calculates a sum with two conditions. That 12,887 is the total for the product flat top in the region Midwest. This is the total for the quad product in the West region. Now, let's drag region down to rows, and we can see yet another pivot. I'm going to drag it above product. I can see that green line. And instantly now I see East, there's all the products. Midwest, there's all the products. Now, these are the same calculations as our cross-tabulated table we saw just a second ago. It's just a different layout. Still another way to do this, we can drag product up to filter. Now, that was dangerous because that filter area shouldn't be sitting right next to our other report. I told you it was dangerous to put it next to other reports. But watch this. This pivot table, I can highlight it. And I'm going to cut and then paste it, move it. But I'm going to use my move cursor. That cursor right there, if I click on the very edge, click and drag down, it moves it. Now I can come up here and select just the quad. Click OK. That over here, this is called the filter. A filter filters the whole report. That means this cell has the condition Midwest. This one has the condition South. But they all have the condition quad. The pivot tables are just amazing. I want to unfilter this. So I'm going to click on the filter button, click all, click OK. Now, one thing about filter is it's kind of hidden. So I'd like a more visual way to access the products. I'm going to come over and drag product off. Make sure a cell is selected in the pivot table. We're going to go up to the Pivot Table Tools, Context Sensitive Ribbon, Analyze, and over in the Filter group, there's a slicer. Now the slicer can come from any one of the fields. I want to say Product. So I check it, click OK, and instantly I get a visual that shows me all the items. I can simply click on Aspen Bellin, and instantly the whole report is filtered. Now we can format this. Slicer Tools, Context Sensitive Ribbons, Options. I'm going to try 2 columns. Come down to the bottom, click and drag. We can add a different color if we want it. I can unfilter everything. If you want the Carlota or the quad in our pivot table report, you can hold the Control key and click, and it will select 2. All right, I'm going to unfilter everything. Now I'm going to click back in the pivot table. You can also add any style you want from over in our list of styles. I'm going to select that one, for example. Now, one last point before we move on to our next example. Remember, we did SUMIFS and then a pivot table. And it seems much easier to do it with a pivot table. And of course it is, and it's more powerful because it's more dynamic in how we can pivot. But there's one advantage to formulas. If we look at this number right here, 274631, if the source data changes, and I'm going to change just one number up here and change it to something big like 50,000. I haven't hit Enter, but when I hit Enter, watch what happens right there and right there. So I'm going to hit Enter. Instantly, it updates with formulas. With the pivot table, it didn't update instantly, but it's easy enough to change. You simply come to your pivot table, right-click, and point to Refresh. And instantly, now it's the same. Not much effort to refresh your pivot table. However, the reason that formulas sometimes are preferred is there are definitely solutions where you do not want to refresh. You're continually changing the data, and so you want your results to continually change. If that's the case, then formulas are your answer. Now I'm going to Control-Z, which undoes the refresh, and then Control-Z, which undoes the typing of the number. All right, so as we can see, the pivot table is a very powerful and easy to use tool. Now I want to create a new report on a new sheet. I want to see a product region cross-tabulated report on a new sheet. So I'm going to click in a single cell, Insert, Pivot Table. It automatically guesses it right. The default is New Worksheet, so I can either click OK or hit Enter. Instantly, we get a new sheet. I'm going to double-click and call this Cross-Tab for Cross-Tabulated Report. Now I want to pull the field list. So with my white arrow cursor, I'm going to click and drag. I'm going to drag product down to rows, region to the columns, sales down to values. Do not like row labels, column labels. Come up to Design, Report Layout, Show in Tabular. Right-click, Number Formatting, something like Currency, click OK. This is called a cross-tabulated report because that calculation right here is for the product doublers in the South. It's as if there is a cross where the calculation has criteria coming from the column and row area. Now it's easy to copy a pivot table. I'm going to highlight the pivot table, Control-C, Control-V. Now imagine we didn't want sum of sales, but we wanted to calculate the max sale. I can simply come somewhere, any one cell in the value area, right-click, and there's 2 ways to make calculations. Summarize values by has the different functions available. Show values as has a bunch of useful calculations like percent of grand total. We'll see this one in our next example. I want to come over to Summarize Values By. I see the max, but if you wanted to see all functions, we click More Options. Now, there's not very many aggregate calculations. There are 11 in total, and you can scroll down and see all those calculations. I'm going to click Max. Click OK. Now notice what happened. Every time I change the pivot table, pivot it, or change the calculation, it automatically auto-fits the columns. I should have done this up here. I'm going to right-click, go down to Pivot Table Options. And if you don't remember where things are, you just click through each one of the tabs, but layout and format. There it is. Auto fit column widths on update. I'm going to uncheck that. Click OK. Right click. Pivot Table Options. Uncheck. Click OK. Highlight B column and drag over all the way to F. And then I'm going to point between any two columns. And when I see my change column cursor, I click and drag. There's the sum of sales. There's the max. I'm going to highlight this table here. Control-C, drag this over. Control-V. I'm going to point to the Smart tag and say, please paste this with the original column widths. Right-click, Summarize Values By, and we're going to say Average. I'm going to go and highlight the original sum, Control-C. I'm going to paste it down here, Control-V. And now I do want to show you right-click, not Summarize Values By where we change the functions, but Show Values As. Now again, we'll see a bunch of these, but a nice easy one to start with is percent of grand total. Now all it did is it took every single individual item and compared it to the grand total. That's why down here we see 100%, and all of the other ones are all smaller than 100%. That is the power of pivot tables. In this example, we did a cross tab where we're making calculations with two conditions, and we did sum, max, average, and even percent of grand total. Wow, pivot tables are powerful and easy. Now I want to go back over to the sheet P1. I want to create two more pivot tables, but the next one is going to be based on the date column. Now, earlier in the video, we saw how to do a monthly report based on sales. With a pivot table, it is amazingly easy. Now, I'm using Excel 2016. It's even easier in Excel 2016. Now I'm going to click in a single cell, and I want to put this monthly, yearly summary report on a new sheet. So I go to Insert, Pivot Tables. I'm clicking OK because I know it got right. The default is New Worksheet. Click OK or hit Enter. I'm immediately going to double-click this and call this Monthly Report and Enter. Now watch this. This is absolutely amazing. Now I'm going to drag the date field, and no matter what version you are in, you can do this. It's a little bit more automatic in Excel 2016, but watch what happens. Remember, that date field contains daily sales. But when I click and drag it here, we can immediately see it grouped it up into years, quarters, and dates. I'm going to come over. I don't want quarters, so I'm going to drag it off. And now I'm going to come over and see what is underneath by clicking the Uncollapse button. You've got to be kidding me. It's got year, month, year, month. Now notice for us in 2016, it grouped automatically. Now, I'll show you two things. One is if you didn't want it to group by year and month, you actually wanted daily sales, then that's pretty annoying. But it's easy to fix. Right-click, and you point to Ungroup. Now, if you're in Excel 2013 or earlier, it didn't group automatically. But all you had to do was come over to the Dates, right-click, Group, and then Group by Months and Year. Click OK. And just like that, in earlier versions, we have the same months and year. What's going to happen if I drag Sales down into the values? Instantly, I have summarized based on month. Now, I don't like row labels, so I come up to Design, Report Layout, Show in Tabular. Right-click, Number Formatting, something like Currency. Click OK. Now, in accounting, oftentimes we like to see the amount of change from period to period. Well, let's go over and we're going to drag the same sales field down a second time. Now we have two sales fields, and we're allowed to make two different calculations. Right-click, and down under Show Values As, there's a bunch of amazing features. Difference from will show us the amount of the change. Percentage difference from will show us the percentage change from period to period. And there's a bunch of other ones we're going to see here. Now, we're going to do difference from. Now, very importantly, it's going to ask us difference from what? Because sometimes in accounting, you want to see the difference all from a base period like January, or you may want to see the difference from each month to month. The base field is the first thing. We want it based on the month. The base item, not January. That would compare all of the items to just January. We could choose any particular month, but I want to say, please compare to the previous month. Now notice date is the name of this field here, which is really our grouped up by month. But when I click OK, there are the differences. And you can do it manually. 11,000 minus 14,000, that's the amount of the change. Now I'm immediately going to come up here and rename this. I'm going to type change and enter. Not only that, but I think I would like this. Even though the field over here is named date because that's the original data set, I'm going to change it in the report to month and enter. Now, let's go and add sales a third time. Right-click, show values as, percent different from. Notice now it says month because that's the base field. I don't want it based on February. I want it based on previous. Click OK. And now we see if we were to compare this minus 3,000 to the starting point 14,000, it would be a downward percentage of about 21%. That's profound. It's making all these calculations with just a few clicks. Now I'm going to click up here and say percent change and enter. Now let's drag sales down again. And sometimes you want to see not the amount or change. You want to see the running total. That means as we go from month to month, we're adding up all previous months. So right-click, show values as, running total in. Now we have a choice here. Do we want a running total in month or in year? If we were to choose year, it would actually keep a running total all the way to the end of the second year. If we choose month, it'll just do a running total for each month and then start over for the next year, which is what we want. Click OK. And all this number right here means is that is the current plus the two previous months total. Down here, it's all of these months. And finally, the grand total will show up in December because it's December and all previous months. Now I'm going to add some number formatting. Right-click, number formatting, currency, click OK. I think I'm going to do that over here too. Number formatting, currency, click OK. Let's rename this. Running total. Sometimes this is called cumulative total. Let's do one more calculation. I'm going to drag this down here. Right-click, show values as, percent running total in. We want it based on month and click OK. Now these are the percentages associated with these numbers. Now what this means is that 80,000 represents 18% of the total revenues for the year. We can see our company is at about 28% by the end of October. So obviously, most of our revenues are coming in the Christmas time, November and December. Right here, by the end of November, we've earned 64% of our revenues. And of course, by the end of December, we've earned 100% of the revenues for the year. Pivot tables are amazing. Now we have another example, and I want to go over to the sheet 2016 DM. Now this example that we're going to see here for pivot tables that will allow us to use two different tables in the pivot table field list is only going to work in Excel 2016. But why am I showing you this? Because this method of using two tables in a pivot table is the future of Excel. Now why is this sheet called 2016 DM because this is only going to work in Excel 2016. And we're going to use the data model. Now, normally in Excel 2016, you have to buy a special version to access the data model that includes Power Pivot. But guess what? I'm going to show you how to access the data model no matter which version of Excel 2016 you have. Now, this is the Data Ribbon tab. And if you don't have the right version, you don't see that button right there, but you will see the Relationship button. And that Relationship button will allow us to create a relationship between these two tables, and then no problem. The Pivot Table field list will allow us to drag fields from one table and a second table. So really what we'll be able to do is simply drag region to the row area, sales to the values area, and instantly we'll have our regional sales report, even though we don't have a helper column for region attached to the sales table. Now, one thing that we have to do before we can use this method is both tables have to be converted to official Excel tables. Now, I've already converted this first table to an Excel table, but let's do the same for this one. Now, notice this is a proper data set. Field names at the top, records and rows, empty cells all the way around. So to convert it to an Excel table, we click in a single cell, go up to Insert, click on the Table button, or notice the keyboard, Control-T. Make sure it says My Table Has Headers, which is a synonym for field names. Click OK. And most importantly, we immediately have to go up to the Table Tools Design Context-Sensitive Ribbon tab, Properties, and that is a bad name. We want to rename this table. So I'm going to click, and I'm going to call this D Sales Rep, and Enter. Once these are both official Excel tables, now we can create a relationship between them. Now, the advantage to Excel tables, Control down arrow, is if I were to ever add records down to the bottom, they would be added to the table object, and anything pointing to these tables, such as our pivot table, would automatically incorporate that new data. Control up arrow. Now I'm going to go up to Data, over to Relationships. Click that button. In the Relationships window, I'm going to say New. Now, the related table down here is the lookup table. And one way to remember that is it says Related Column Primary. Remember, the first column of a lookup table always has to have a unique list, meaning one of each item. Primary means primary key in databasing, and that means first column with a unique list. So if you remember that word, that'll help you remember that this is the lookup table. Related table, lookup table. That means I'm going to select this one first, and I'm going to say D Sales Sales Rep. Then I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to select the column, first column, that has a unique list called a primary key. Now I'm going to come up to Table and select F Sales. Now over to Foreign Key, and it's got to be the Sales Rep. And when I click OK, it's going to take a while because it's adding them to the data model. Now, I'm going to show you that it actually went over the data model. Even though you don't have this feature, the pivot table will still have both tables and will drag and drop. But just in case you have the right feature, I'm going to click on Manage Data Model. And that opens up the Power Pivot for Excel Manage Data Model. It added both tables here. And on the Home Ribbon tab in the Power Pivot window, we can go over to Diagram View. And there is a visual that shows you that there is a relationship between the lookup table, D Sales Rep. Notice it says 1. That means this primary key sales rep right there, boop, that has exactly one of each item. But of course, over here on the many side, that little asterisk is supposed to be many. We can have many, many sales rep in our sales table. Now I'm going to close this Power Pivot Manage Data Model window. Remember, you don't have to have that. Those tables are there behind the scenes. Now when I click in this first table and go up to Insert, pivot table. We very carefully want to say use this workbook's data model. I'm definitely going to put it on a new worksheet, which is the default. I click OK or hit Enter. And look at that. We have both tables. Now, one icon method of verifying that this table is actually in the data model is that black line at the top only shows up when your table is from the data model. Now, watch this. We're simply going to drag region down to rows. Come up and open the sales. Notice we're dragging fields from two different tables. Sales over to values. And just like that, we have created our summary sales report for region from two different tables. Now I'm immediately going to fix that row labels. Design, layout, report layout, show in tabular. I'm immediately going to right-click number formatting. Click on currency, click OK. Control and roll the wheel on my mouse to zoom in. And that is how we get two tables into our pivot table field list, and we can drag and drop whichever fields we want. Now I'm going to double click this sheet down here and call this DMPT for Data Model Pivot Table. All right, so there's a preview if you have Excel 2016, or just a preview of how pivot tables will work in all future versions. Hey, we talked a lot about pivot tables on P1. We did the basics of pivot table on crosstab. We not only saw how to do crosstab with various calculations, but we saw how to copy our pivot tables. We also did this monthly pivot table report where we grouped individual days into months, and then we did a bunch of cool calculations. All right, we actually will have one last pivot table example at the very end when we see how to import, clean, and transform data with Power Query. But our next topic, we're going to go over to FF Sheet and talk about something called Flash Fill. Now, imagine you have names in a column, and you want to just extract the first name. Or you wanted to list just the last name and change the case so it's capital D-I-M. Now, in the old days, you either did it manually or you knew how to do it with formulas. But there's a great new feature, and it's over on the Data Ribbon tab in the Data Tools called Flash Fill. Now, notice what the keyboard is. It's Control-E. Now, Flash Fill is called by Microsoft Programming by Example. Now, what that means is that we have to type what we want in this column, and internally Microsoft will try and create a program that will do the work for us. Now, one thing about Flash Fill is you got to be sure you know what type of data is in your column. If we want to extract just the first name, that's pretty easy. Notice 2 names, 3 names. There's 2 names and an abbreviation. So there's some variation in the type of data. But if we want first name, the pattern is really easy for us to figure out and for Microsoft's program by example. Notice if we want first name, it's everything before the first space. And it doesn't matter which cell or what type of data. For this name where we have an abbreviation as our middle name, the first name is still before the first space. Here, first name is still before the first space. So Flash Fill has no problem with this. Now I'm going to show you 2 ways to do this. If I type Mo and Enter, then I type the letter G, this ghost list appears. This is Flash Fill giving you a list of suggested items. As I look through the list, that looks great. So when I hit Enter, instantly it flash fills. Now, the other way to do this, if you are sure that the pattern for extracting the data is consistent, you can just type MO, Enter, Control-E. Now, last name is going to be similar to first. It's everything after the last space. So Flash Fill will have no problem with this. Now, this time I'm going to type the last name but change the case. When I hit Enter and now I type a letter T, instantly it's getting all the last names. When I hit Enter, Flash Fill. First and middle. This is where it's not going to be so easy, but let's try it. MO, enter. GG, uh-oh, it's not quite right, so I'm going to keep typing. And then I'm going to type ALBO. Well, it didn't get it, but I'm going to try Control E. Now notice it almost got it, but when I got to the actual letter, it missed the period. Now what this means is in order for Microsoft to create a true program underneath, we have to give it an example of all situations. So I'm going to try this one again. This is really the essence of flash fill. You have to know your data, know exactly how many different types of examples you need to give flash fill, and then give it all of them. So I'm going to type Mo, GG Albo, and then I'm going to go down to Cody, a period, and now the column has all three examples. Now I can Control E, and just like that. So what's the rule? Make sure you know your data, give flash fill all possible examples, and you're good to go. Now we can reverse and insert and change case. DIM, comma. That's inserting a different character, space, and then MO. Now I definitely want to skip the middle name here. So now I'm going to Control E, and just like that, it gets the job done. Here's another great example for flash fill. We're given telephone numbers, and we want the characters open, close parentheses, and a dash. So I'm going to type open parentheses 206, close parentheses, space 587 dash 4545. Now notice there's going to be no ambiguity if the entire column is filled with digits like this. I hit Enter and Control E, and my telephone numbers are done. Another useful example is sometimes we have some number that's an ID, like asset ID, but we cannot import this into our database system unless there's a lead apostrophe. Now we could build a formula to add a lead apostrophe and then paste special values or do it manually, but watch this. I'm just going to type a lead apostrophe 90513, enter. And there's going to be no ambiguity because they're all the same. Control E, and you've got to be kidding me. If I click in each cell, I can see the actual lead apostrophe. Now that error is totally annoying because Excel's telling you this is a number stored as text, but that's what we need to import this data into a different system. One last example. We pasted something from the internet and we want to extract just the number. The pattern looks consistent. I'm not even going to bother typing. I'm going to Control C, Control V, Enter, Control E, and I am done. Flash fill. You give it some examples. It builds a program behind the scenes and gives you what you want. All right, now our next topic, I'm going to go over to the sheet charts. Now we'd like to look at some basic business charts. Now this first category, this is called a column. This is called a bar. And you use these charts to compare differences across categories. And in general, you want to use either the column or the bar instead of a pie chart. Research has shown that people recognize the difference between heights or lengths better than they do pie pieces. And we'll see these examples in just a moment. If you have a cross-tabulated table, which means you have two variables, then you either want to use the stacked column or bar, or a clustered column or bar. And we'll see these two in just a moment. If you have a number variable and you want to show it over time or over categories, you can use a line chart. Now, the key to line chart is there's one number and some variable along the horizontal axis that is equidistance. And finally, we have the XY scatter. This is when you have XY data and you want to compare the relationship between X and Y. All right, let's go over to the sheet column and bar and pie. Now, here's our data set, and I've already summarized the data. And we simply want to show for each month and for each sales channel the revenue. Now, this is a proper data set in essence. We have field names at the top. Our category and our number, we can click in a single cell, and the charting engine will know what to do. We go up to Insert, over to Charts, And here's our first one, the drop down for column chart. Now, in general, you do not want to use 3D charts. Mostly those are chart junk. You usually want to stick with the 2D. Now, I'm simply going to click this first one, clustered column. Now, that chart right out of the box looks pretty good. And the key to charts is that you don't want any chart junk, which means you don't want any elements in the chart that don't help contribute to the message. Or in the case of our title up here, you don't want any elements in the chart that are not really helping. Now, if this was part of a larger report where it was obvious what the revenue was, that chart title might be OK. But I'd actually like to link that chart title to this more explicit label over here, the name of the company and when the sales occurred. Now, I'd like to link this chart title to the cell B2 over here. So if this changes over here, it'll automatically be reflected in the chart. Now, the way you do that is you make sure that the chart title has a solid line around the outside. If you click it inside, you see that dotted line? We can't get this label to link. So make sure you click on the outside. There's my move cursor. I see the solid line. I immediately go up to the formula bar, click in the formula bar, type an equal sign, click on B2. I can see my formula up here, and the formula is polite. It puts the actual sheet name in and the cell reference. Notice the chart over here. As soon as I hit the Enter key, that registers that formula inside the chart title. Now, sometimes if it's not obvious what categories these are, we might need to add a chart label down here, but that chart's looking pretty good. Now, this is a column chart, and I want to click on the outside edge so the solid line is around the column chart. And I want you to copy it with Control-C and then click in a cell below it and Control-V. Now I want to change the chart type to a bar. I can do this a couple ways. Right-click, and there it is. Change chart type. Or you can come up, Escape. You can come up to Chart Tools, Context-Sensitive Ribbon. Click on Design. And right over here is Change Chart Type. I'm going to click Change Chart Type. And over on the left, I'm going to click Bar. Now we've taken our column and tilted it on its side so it's horizontal now. Click OK. Now, the essence of both of these charts is the same. We are comparing differences across categories. When you use a bar chart like this, it tends to emphasize the differences between the categories more forcefully than a column chart. Also, sometimes if you have really long labels, over here the label is constrained by just that distance. Whereas if you have a really long label, the chart will automatically accommodate the long label. All right, I'm going to drag this over to the side. Notice I clicked on the very outside edge. One thing that's tricky about charts is if you come and click in the middle and expect to move it, you might not. You might click somewhere and click, and it might not move. So you want to make sure and click on the outside edge. Now, I would like to create a column chart from the sales channel table. Insert column 2D. I'm going to click on the chart title. Equal sign shoots me up to the formula bar. Click in B2 and Enter. Notice that time I didn't click up in the formula bar first. I just typed an equal sign. Now, in this case, I would like to add a label to the bottom to make sure that we know these are the sales channel. I'm going to click on the green plus. And there's a bunch of things we can either add or take away from the chart. Axis title is what we want. I want to go over and click the black arrow and say primary horizontal. Immediately, I can see it's got the solid line. I type an equal sign. That shoots me up to the formula bar. And then I'm going to click on sales channel label right there and Enter. Now, notice if I don't like the way this looks and I have it linked to the cell, I simply edit the cell, space, and Enter, and there we go. Another thing we can do is you can click on any particular element in the chart. I'm going to click on the columns. And I want to open up the task pane to format elements in the chart. You can right-click Format Data Series, or as we said earlier in the video, the keyboard Control-1 works for format cells and chart elements. Now, there's a couple icons over here. You notice we can change the gap width here. I want to click on the Fill bucket. Go to Fill. Come down and click on Vary Colors by Point. Now I want to come back to the plus and go down to Data Labels. And no way, it'll put the actual numbers at the top and even take the formatting from the cells. Now this is a perfect example of chart junk. I'm going to click Escape here. Chart junk. We have some numbers here and some numbers here. In general, you don't need them in both places. So I'm going to click on the axis, and when I see the solid line, I'm going to use the Delete key to get rid of that. Now, I'd like to do one last thing. I'd like to come here, increase the font. I can come up to the Home Ribbon tab, increase the font to 12, and I can use bold or I can Control B. Now I want to drag this to the side, and now I want to Control C to copy it. And then I want to click over here, Control V, and I want to change the chart type. Right-click, Change Chart Type. And I want to go to the dreaded pie, which in recent years, over the last 5 years, data analysts and business intelligence specialists who build dashboards tend to not use the pie chart. And the reason why is research clearly shows that people understand the difference between columns and bars more easily than they do pies. But let's look at a pie anyway, because there are a few circumstances where you might want to use them. And one of them is when you have very few categories. Generally, 3 or 2 categories, then a pie might be efficient. Not only that, but the pie chart has an interesting feature. We can add percentages automatically without actually calculating them in the cells. Now I want to click on the data labels here. I already have the task pane open. If I didn't, I can Control 1. But watch this. When I Control 1, it'll actually go to the correct icon up here. So I have the data label selected. And be careful. If you select it twice like that, it selects just one. That's not what I want. I want all of them. So I'm going to click in the white, click back on, make sure that they're all selected, and use Control 1. Notice that moved the task pane to the correct location. And look at that. Under Label Options, we could show the value, we can show the category, and we can show a percentage. That's pretty cool. Now, as I look at the chart, that label kind of is crowded there. I could come over to Label Position. I could put them in the center. Probably have to change the font. Inside, oh, maybe. I'm going to keep them outside. I would like to instead rotate the chart. So I have to come back inside the chart, click on the particular chart element, and hopefully it shows up here. And sure enough, it does. Angle of first slice. So I'm going to click and drag. Maybe something right about there. All right, I'm going to click inside the sheet, Control and Roll. In general, we don't want to use pie charts. We want to use column and bar. But if you have only a few pieces, sometimes pies are OK. Now I'm going to use my scroll arrow to move the sheets. And we're going to go over to the sheet Stacked and Clustered. All right, now we'd like to talk about what kind of chart we use when we have a cross-tabulated table. We can either use clustered column or stacked column. Now, the charting engine is built perfect for pivot table cross tabs. We click in a single cell, go up to Insert, over to Charts. There's that column. It's a really common and effective chart. And guess what? We just used the same clustered column we did in our last example. But look at this. It pretty much came out looking perfect from the start. However, we do have these gray drop-downs which appear because we used a pivot table to create our cross tab. Not only that, but if you were to come over to the pivot table and remove one of the items, the chart is connected. So that could be a real positive, or maybe it's not a positive. I'm going to click Control Z to bring that back. Now, once you have the chart, maybe you don't want these gray buttons. So I'm going to right click. And down here it says Hide All Field Buttons on Chart. As we're looking at our chart, we're always thinking about chart junk. It doesn't seem like there's any elements that are not helping to contribute to the message. One thing, this is preference. Maybe you don't want to see the horizontal line, so I'm going to click on them. And be careful. If you click on the solid line, then it will try and delete everything or do something to everything. You want to make sure if you want to do something to the grid lines that you see those translucent circles. I'm going to hit the delete key. I'm going to click on the legend. Control-1 to go to the right part of the task pane. And guess what? I'm going to move the legend to the bottom, just like that. One other thing, maybe I want to indicate, like we did in our last charts, the actual content of the number. So I'm going to go to my plus and click Chart Title. I see the solid line. I type an equal sign that shoots me up to the formula bar. I click on B2 and Enter. That is looking pretty good. Now, the clustered column is showing us two variables. There's a variable along the horizontal axis and then in the legend. When you use a clustered column, it tends to emphasize the variable in the legend. We clearly can compare the three different sales channels for each month. Now, we want to look at another option, so I'm going to copy this. Control-C, click down below, Control-V. And I want to change this from a clustered column to a stacked column. Right-click, change chart type. And notice it's got column, so I'm going to come over to stacked column. I'm going to click on stacked column, click OK. Now, the difference is now the emphasis is on the items in the horizontal axis. We can clearly compare each month and see that June is the biggest. But we still have our second variable, sales channel, within each column. So those are two useful charts when you have a cross-tabulated table. Now let's go over and look at our next chart. I'm going to click on the line sheet, and we've got to talk about a line chart. Now, anytime you have a number and then some category, here we have a time category, year, and you want to plot the up and down trends or changes over time or over a category, we can use a line chart. So we have a proper data set. I'm going to click in a single cell, go over to Insert, and in the chart group, I'm going to select the drop down for line. We're going to use the line with marker. Click, and we can already see trouble. The line chart assumed that we wanted both numbers plotted as a line. But really, we want the year listed along the horizontal axis. Now, the most important lesson in charting, since the charting engine doesn't always get it right, is to know how to change the data. We can go up to the Chart Tools Design Context-Sensitive ribbon, and there it is. The real power of charting is the Select Data button. Or we can come down to get our Select Data, right-click in the white area of the chart, and point to Select Data. And we have what are called series. The word series is the term that Microsoft uses to mean the numbers. And then category. Those are the items listed along the horizontal axis. But the real power is the fact that we can select a particular series, click Add if we wanted to add a new one, click Edit if we wanted to edit that one, or remove it. In our case, I have year selected, so I'm going to use the Remove button. And just like that, we can see our chart down there has removed that. Now, horizontal category, we want to click Edit. And this dialog box allows us to highlight the labels we want for our horizontal axis. We can already see that looking good. Click OK. So the real power of charting is knowing that you can come here and change anything, add, edit, remove, and edit even the horizontal axis. All right, I'm going to click OK. That chart's looking pretty good. We have our years and we have our up and down trend. Now we can do a couple things here. I really want the chart title to say Win Sport. That's the name of the company. So I'm actually going to come over to the cell, put it in edit mode. I double click before the S, and I'm going to type Win Sport and a space. That's the name of the company, and enter. I can come up here and double click if I want to best fit that column. There it is. It's now listed Win Sport Sales. Now, another thing we might want to do is we might want to start this vertical axis at 400,000. So I'm going to select the vertical axis and then use Control-1 to open up our task pane. And sure enough, there's the minimum. We can highlight that 0.0 and type 400,000 and tab. And just like that, it starts at 400,000. Now, this legend down here looks to me like chart junk. I don't really need it, so I'm going to click on it and use the delete key. And that is looking good. We see our category. We see our up and down changes. Now, actually, if we had more lines, like we had another column with costs, you could add that and it would show that line below. So line charts, when you have one number and some category. All right, let's go over and talk about an XY scatter. I'm going to click on the sheet XY scatter. Anytime you have an X variable and a Y variable and you want to visually see if there's a relationship, and we want to see if there's a relationship between hours studied and score on a test. So we gather this data from a particular class. We're going to click in a single cell, go up to Insert, over to the sharding group, drop down. And the rule of thumb is this. If you've collected some raw data and you want to see if there's a relationship, you use the scatter chart that just shows you the markers for each X and Y. But if you have a model, like a fixed cost analysis chart, then you use the line. That's not what we have here. We have raw data. So I'm going to click on this one. There is the chart. And there is one glaring error in this chart. Can anyone see what it is? Yeah, that is absolutely correct. Number. I have no idea what those numbers are. This is an example where you must have labels on both axes. So I'm going to come over to the plus. Axis titles, I'm checking it because I want both. Notice the Y has the solid line. So I type in equal sign. It shoots me up to the formula bar. I click on the Y variable header and enter. Click down on X, solid line, equal sign. Click on the X and enter. I don't like the chart title, so I'm going to click on an equal sign, click on E1 and enter. Font size, I'm going to go to Home, decrease the font size. I'm going to go to the markers and watch this. Right click. And if you're in managerial accounting or your statistics class and you're required to show the equation in R squared, you go down to Add Trend Line, and it does the linear regression for you. Absolutely amazing. There's the linear trend line. We come down here, say Display Equation on Chart, and display R squared. And there we go. I'm going to click on the edge and try and drag it down to the corner. All right, so that is our XY scatter. We can clearly see that there is a relationship. As hours increase, the score increases. All right, so we saw how to do an XY scatter. That's when you have two numbers and you want to see a relationship. Line chart, one category and a number looking at the up and down trends. When you have a cross tab, you can either use the clustered column or the stacked column, depending on your emphasis. And over on column and bar, in general, you want to use column or bar. And in some rare cases, you might want to use a pie. Now we have our last epic topic. I'm going to go over to the sheet PQ. Now on this sheet PQ, we have some notes about the amazing new feature Power Query. Now Power Query is going to allow us to clean data, transform data, and import data from external sources. Now I want to go over and look at a picture of what we're going to do on the PQ report sheet. We have 12 different Excel files in a folder, and each one of these files looks like this. Date, product supplier, product ID, sales rep, region sales, and cost of goods sold. In each workbook, there's a single sheet that says Sheet 1, but we need to take all 12 files, import them, and have them combined into a single table. Not only that, but notice our data set combined product and supplier. Remember what we said, raw data has to be in its smallest form. We need to use product and supplier in a separate column so we can do proper data analysis. The process of breaking these two items apart from a single cell into two different cells is the cleaning part of data analysis. The combining of all these files into a single file, that's the transforming part of data analysis. The importing part, that's what Power Query will do. It'll take all these, allow us to clean, and it will dump it in Excel all onto a single sheet. And then we'll make this amazing sales, cost of goods sold, gross profit report using a pivot table. Now, I actually want to go look at these files before we start Power Query. Now, when you download the files from the link below the video, you'll see this zipped file. You'll have to download it and unzip it. Then when you double click it, there's actually a bunch of files for the year 2017. We're going to double click all tables. We're going to start building our process of data cleaning, transforming, importing, and pivot table using 2016 data. And guess what? The amazing part of Power Query is later when we get new Excel files, we will just copy and paste them into our folder. We will click refresh in our pivot table, and the pivot table will instantly update with our cost of goods sold, gross profit report. All right, we're going to go back over to Excel. Now, where is Power Query? If you go to the Data Ribbon tab, it's in the Get and Transform group, and you want to find the New Query button. Now, depending on what version you are in, this New Query button will be in a different location, but there it is. That's going to be our Power Query. Now, if you have earlier versions, Excel 2010 or 13, you can actually download Power Query as an add-in. All right, let's see how to do this. We're going to go to the New Query. And by the way, this sheet right here, it doesn't matter which sheet we're on because Power Query will open up a different window. We'll edit, and then we'll import it onto its own new sheet. All right, I'm going to go up to this New Query. We're going to point to From File, and this is so amazing. Not an individual file we're importing, but everything from a particular folder. So I click From Folder. It wants to know where that folder is. I click Browse. You browse to wherever you downloaded it. Be sure and open up. Do not point to the CWU All Excel Files. Point to the All Tables folder. Now, when we tell Power Query to look inside a folder, it will try and import every single file in that folder. I'm going to click OK. Click OK. Now, it opens up this intermediate step before we get to our editor. Now, if you had lots of different files, like they weren't all Excel and they weren't all of our sales file, you'd actually have to click Edit and go through a separate process to exclude file types that you might not want. But if you're sure that you have all of the exact files and they're all the same files, we can click the Combine button. Now remember, we looked at a preview of that file, and every single one of these files has a single sheet with data sets. I'm going to go to Combine, click the drop down, and I'm going to say Combine and Edit. Now, it opens up yet another intermediate step, and it's asking us here to please select a particular sheet so it can use it as an example. It's going to use this one file with date, product, supplier, product ID, and all the other columns. It's going to use that one file as an example, and it will build the code to import all of the other sheets from all the other files and dump them into a single table. Now, again, if all the files weren't the same or you had different file types, you'd have to do this a different way. And actually, you can search my YouTube channel. I have a Power Query playlist of videos, and the first couple videos show you all the different options for importing different files. All right, watch this. I'm going to click OK. And look at that. All of these files combined into a single table. Now, what it did behind the scenes is quite amazing. It built a bunch of separate queries. We're not going to go into it in this video, especially since if all the files are really the same, you don't need to worry about this. And look over here. It listed all the steps that it performed for us. Again, if you're curious about all these steps, I have other videos at YouTube that explain that. Now I want to come over in the very first step is I'm going to name this because this name will become the name of our table in Excel. All sales data and enter. Now we can come up and clean our data set. Now the first thing is it added the source name, and sometimes that's really helpful because maybe the year data was in the file name and we needed that in our column. But we don't need that. We have our date column right here. So I'm going to come to this column, right click, and we want to point to remove. That'll remove this column. When we click remove, we are transforming our data set. Now we need to clean up the data. Now notice the product and supplier are always separated by a /. Now that is called a delimiter. A delimiter is something that separates different fields of data. So I'm going to click the column header or field name. Up in the home ribbon, we can see split. We can also right click, split column by delimiter. Now you need to know the word delimiter. That just means, like we said, some character that separates the data. So I'm going to click by delimiter. It's trying to guess, but it didn't guess right. I don't see / here, but no problem. I can type custom, come to this text box, type a /. Now it knows what is separating the data. When I click OK, from one column will come two. Now I immediately want to come up and name this column. I'm going to name it product and enter. Double click, and we want to name this supplier and enter. Now this product ID, although it may be useful in some circumstances, we're never going to use it. So why clutter up our spreadsheet? Right click remove. Sales rep, region, sales, cost of goods sold. All those columns are looking good. Now we do want to make sure that the data type for each one of these columns or fields is correct. Now if you click on the icon, it gives you the drop-down list. The reason this is so important is because we want this imported as a date. If it's not a date, you may not be able to analyze it the way you want. So Power Query, different than Excel, you have to be specific about the type of data. So we have date. That icon means text, which is fine. Text, text, text. That icon means if we click the drop-down decimal number. Now decimal numbers will import up to 15 decimals. I'm going to choose currency, which will import up to 4 decimals. Now we only had 2 in this column, so that is fine. Now here we have cost of goods sold, and there's some extraneous decimals here. And earlier, at the very beginning of this video, we saw how to use the round function in Excel. Well, over here in Power Query, we can incorporate that into our data cleaning. We select the column, come over to transform, over to rounding, or we can right click, come down to transform, round. And we're going to use round. This does a different type of rounding. It actually does what's called halfway even rounding or banker's rounding, which is more accurate than the rounding we learned in school. The round function over in Excel actually does the official rounding we do in school. This does halfway even rounding. We tell it how many decimals, click OK. Now I want to click data type and say, hey, this is currency. Now we have combined all of our tables, done our data cleaning. Now we're ready to load. Now notice we named it all sales data. So we need to look over here in the queries pane. And notice there's a number of different queries here. We very carefully want to select all sales data. This is the query that we want to load to our sheet. Once we have it selected, we can come up to Home, Close. There's a Close and Load button. There are different options for where to load this, but if you want to load it as a new sheet, you simply click this button. And just like that, look at that, Sheet 1. I'm going to immediately double-click this and call this All Data and Enter. And when I click in a cell and use Control down arrow, You got to be kidding me. 11,000 rows of data. Control Home. Only the columns we wanted and with our cleaned data. Now we're allowed to use this to do data analysis. Now we're going to create a pivot table. We go back over to our Power Query report sheet. This is what the pivot table is going to look like. We're going to have product in the row, region as a slicer, and we're going to need to calculate total sales, cost of goods sold, and then gross profit and percent gross profit. We'll go back over to our all data. A single cell selected. I can go over to Insert Pivot Table, and I'm going to put it on a new sheet. Click OK or hit Enter. I'm going to drag the pivot table field list over here. We want to drag product down to rows. Then we'll take our sales, drag it into values. I'm going to immediately come up and right-click number formatting. Select currency, and I think I'm going to show 0 decimals. Remember, this displays it. It doesn't actually round it. Click OK. Drag cost of goods sold. Right-click number formatting. Currency 0 decimals. Click OK. Now notice the calculations are in successive columns, and I would like to list them vertically. So I'm going to come down to the column area and drag values down to the row area and drop it below product. Immediately I'm going to come up, and I don't like that row label. Plus I want these in a separate column, so I come up to Design, Layout, Report Layout, Show in Tabular. Now in order to calculate gross profit, we need to take sales minus cost of goods sold. Well, if we were in the cells, we'd just do this cell right here minus this one. But this is a pivot table. We can actually make a formula inside of our pivot table. Make sure the pivot table is selected. Go up to Analyze. And in the Calculation group, Fields, Items, and Set, you click that drop down. And we're going to create a calculated field. I click. We're going to name this new field. It'll appear in our pivot table field list. I'm going to put GP for gross profit. And then it's saying, hey, what's your formula? I'm going to backspace to get rid of that 0. And look at this. We're allowed to come down here for our fields. Double-click sales. It puts the field name in minus double-click cost of goods sold. And there's our formula. I'm going to click Add. Click OK. And look at that. Let's go back up and create our percentage formula. Field items and sets. Drop down, calculated field. This one's going to be called GP%. And then I want to backspace on the 0. And now I can use the formula I just created, gross profit divided by our sales. Click OK. Now I'm very carefully going to right-click the cell associated with sum of GP. We're going to fix those labels in just a second. Right-click number formatting. And I want to show this as a percentage. And let's say 2 decimals. Click OK. Now, let's change the names here. And I want you to notice something over here. It says sales. So if I type sales here, if I hit Enter, it will not work because there's already a name of a field over here. But I can trick it by typing a space. Enter. Notice it changes all the way down. That's pretty cool. Cost of goods sold. Space and Enter. Now I can name this GP space and Enter. GP space percentage space and Enter. That is looking amazing. Now let's add our slicer. I'm going to move this out of the way. A cell selected. I come up to Analyze, Filter, Insert Slicer. I'm going to check region. Click OK. Now we can format the slicer, maybe 2 columns, change the size. Maybe we can change the color. We can also click back in our pivot table, go over to Pivot Table Context Sensitive Ribbons, Design, click the drop down, and we can change the style. Maybe that one right there. Now I'd like to actually add the year to this as a condition. Now remember, we only have 2016 data here, but when we drop the new files into that folder and refresh this, this will update. So I need to group by date. So I'm going to drag the date field down to columns, and it instantly shows months over here. If we look over here, it looks like it only grouped it by month. So I'm going to come over to the actual date field and right-click group, and then I'm going to say years and unchecked days. So I have months and years. Click OK. Now I can see my months and years up here. Over here in the columns, I can see years and date. I'm going to drag date off. And now I see 2016. Now let's come down here and name this. This is not a good name. I'm going to call this GP Report and enter. Now the big drum roll, I'm going to actually save this. We're going to go over to Windows Explorer. And here's the All Tables folder that Power Query is pointing to. When I double click it, it's only got the 2016. Click the back. I want to copy all of these 2017 files by clicking on the first one. Before clicking on the last one, I hold Shift. Now I Control C, double click to open that up, and Control V. Now instead of 12 files, there are 24. When I go back over to Excel to our pivot table, I want to show the query pane. So I go to Data and say Show Queries. Here are all the queries, and there's our all sales data. When I right-click and point to Refresh, watch what happens. It says Loading Data. Now there's 23,000 records. If I, on the All Data sheet, click in a cell, Control down arrow, New Data. Now I can go back over to the gross profit report, right-click, refresh, and look at that. That is amazing. That makes our reporting tasks in Excel so much easier. We have one tool that can clean, transform, import all of our data. Wow, that was an amazing way to end this video with a pivot table report based on first 11,000 and then 23,000 rows of data. Now we saw how to use Power Query. In this video, we talked about charts. We talked about the XY scatter chart for two numbers, the line chart for a single number, stack column, which are good for cross-tabulated tables. Column and bar charts, those are great for comparing differences across categories. We talked about the amazing flash fill. We talked about Excel 2016 data model allowing us to use two different tables in a pivot table report. We talked all about pivot tables. We saw how to group dates. We saw how to do multiple cross tabs. We defined data analysis and business intelligence. We talked all about the VLOOKUP function. We talked about SUMIFS and COUNTIFS, the if function, and we started it all off with a discussion of formulas, cell references, number formatting, and even the round function. All right, if you like this video, be sure to subscribe and click that thumbs up button. All right, we'll see you next video.